If the first chapter of The American Dog was written by crossing a land bridge and a vast ocean, the next chapter was written in the messy ink of a newspaper and the stiff upper neck of colonial law. By the time this new world became the 13 colonies, the dog had moved from the woods to the porch. It was a neighbor. Dogs were named in wills, searched for in newspapers, and regulated by town council. This was the moment the dog had arrived, not just on the shore, but into the American social contract. This is the moment the bond became a matter of public record.
In 1704, the American dog finally made headlines. That year, the Boston Newsletter began printing the daily reality of a new world. To understand this, you have to forget the internet. In the 1700s, the newspaper was a social media. The television and the town square all rolled into one. If you didn't read it in the Weekly Gazette or see the newest laws nailed to the heavy oak door of the local church, you didn't know the rules. And for the colonial dog, the rules were changing fast. Before we had microtrips, we had the lost and found section. Lost, about 20 days since, a white pointer with a brown spot on the root of its tail. Whoever will bring the said dog to Hugh Gain shall have a guinea reward and no questions asked. These ads are the messy ink of human attachment. People paid hard-earned currency to put an ad in the paper for a specific face and a specific name. It's the first time we see the American heart in print, missing a dog. But the papers were also the voice of the stiff-necked law, and buried in their columns, we find something telling. The dog had become taxable. In places like Pennsylvania, records from 1775 show money collected under a simple label, dog tax. It wasn't a single unified law across all colonies, but a local solution to a growing problem. Dogs protected homes, but they also threatened livestock. And in an economy built on sheep, that made them a liability the town could not ignore. So a price was placed on ownership. Not everywhere, not always the same, but enough that by the final years of the colonial period, the message was clear. If you had a dog, the town expected its due. The law knew how to handle wolves. By the mid-1700s, Virginia was paying bounties for their heads because they were tearing through sheep, cattle, and livelihoods. And the law knew how to handle damage. As early as 1705, it required payment, sometimes double, when livestock were wounded or killed, even by those hunting with dogs. But dogs were different. They belonged to someone, and that made them harder to control. By 1769, Virginians were writing to their leaders with a new complaint. Dogs running at large were destroying flocks and had become a greater nuisance than wolves. That threat was the same, but the solution was not, because one was a wild predator and the other slept on your neighbor's porch. Moving from the town square into the private home, the records get more intimate. Colonial records tell us a story of both the prominent and the everyday man in love with their dog. In episode 2, we mentioned how the English gentlemen brought their dogs to American shores with a social ladder, forcing their dogs to climb it. The dog we focused on was the English Foxhound, which would eventually become the American Foxhound. But did you know that the father of our nation, our first president, George Washington, played a role in that transformation? Long before he became president, or even a general, Washington was breeding his hounds with intention. At Mount Vernon, he worked to refine them for the land they now lived on, eventually crossing his English stock with French hounds. These weren't just imported dogs anymore. They were becoming something new. He named them, recorded them, managed them like a breeder, not just an owner. And in the letters of the time, we see just how central these dogs were. Hunting wasn't just a necessity. It was an invitation, a shared social ritual among gentlemen. In a letter dated 1768, written to Washington, the invitation is clear. His hounds expected, the hunt assumed, the gathering already understood. This wasn't occasional. This was culture. But it wasn't just the famous. When we move beyond the letters of presidents and into the records of everyday colonial life, the story doesn't disappear. It sharpens. In a 1764 Virginia estate inventory, we find 2 hounds listed alongside cattle, corn, and tools, counted, valued, and recorded as part of a working household. Not named, not sentimentalized, but present, legally recognized, economically accounted for. And that tells us something important, because by the 1700s, dogs had secured a place in the structure of American life, not as heirs, but as something just as enduring. They were part of the system, part of the land, and part of the lives being built here, one household at a time. But colonial life was also a world of hard edges. Restraint wasn't about obedience. It was about survival. A collar wasn't soft leather and brass. It was thick, stiff, sometimes iron, often spiked, not for fashion, but for armor. This iron crown had a long, brutal lineage, born in the sheep fields of Europe as protection against wolves, and carried across the Atlantic into a land with even bigger threats. Here, in the American wild, it became something simpler, a last line of defense. Hand-forged by a local blacksmith, it was the only thing standing between a family dog and the crushing jaw of a black bear. In the colonies, a collar wasn't a symbol, it was a lifeline. But there was one thing they could never fully control: the madness, rabies. They didn't understand the disease, but they understood the outcome: death. And when it appeared, fear moved faster than reason. In colonial newspapers, we see it unfold in real time. A child bitten in the face, livestock turning wild and dying days later, dogs once trusted suddenly suspected, and the response was swift and absolute. In some towns, it wasn't just the sick animals that were destroyed. It was all of them. Entire communities, acting out of fear, wiped out every dog they had. Not because they knew which one carried the disease, but because they didn't. Because in that moment, every dog became a question mark, a risk, a possible death sentence waiting in the dark. Status didn't matter. Ownership didn't matter. Whether it was a gentleman's prized hound or a working farm dog, if the fear took hold, they were all treated the same. Because in colonial America, loyalty could not outrun terror, and your most trusted companion could become the one thing you feared most.
Life in the colonies could be harsh. Humans and dogs were subject to some cruel realities. Transitioning from the swamps, fields, and woods did not mean automatic protection in the village. But they were given a higher status within the heart, as evidenced by numerous paper accounts. By the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the dog had declared its place in history too. Written accounts prove they were not just animals, they were partners in the alliance. Man may think he adapted the dog to fit our new nation, but the truth is, they adapted together.
Yeah.
Learning the ways of the colonies was as much an adaptation for man as it was for the dog. Navigating a society together was a natural fit. America 250, the dogs. Because this part of our history is written in ink, we know them. Their story is just as profound as that of their humans. Because as we were becoming a country, a nation, we were a pack.
This is America 250, The Dogs. This has been Episode 3.